Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You ever think back to how, almost everything used to say made in insert country on it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, it was this big
It
revelation.
was. I mean, it felt like the world was shrinking or something, you know?
Yeah, like we were all part of this, global village.
Exactly. And it's basically globalization in a nutshell, right? But today, we're diving into whether all that, well, if those days are over.
And we've got a great guide for this deep dive. Elisabeth Braw's new book, it's called Get This, NUW, Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World.
Okay, so that title alone is a mouthful.
Mm.
But it sounds like she's getting straight to the point. Is globalization on its way out?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
But the book itself is amazing. It's packed with insights about, well, everything, really. Where did this whole globalization thing come from? What made it so powerful for so long? And of course, what's changing now?
I'm intrigued, but I gotta be honest, sometimes these big picture topics can get a little, dry,
Yeah.
like textbooky.
Oh, tell me about it.
So how does Braw keep it interesting?
Well, and this is what I love about her approach. She tells the story of globalization through the eyes of the people who actually lived it. So we're talking CEOs, factory workers, even politicians.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's like getting the inside scoop from all sides.
Exactly. And it's their experiences, their stories that really bring this whole thing to life. You get a sense of just how quickly things changed and how those on the front lines were kind of just, making it up as they went along.
That's fascinating because for a long time, it did feel like globalization was this unstoppable force, like it was all part of some master plan.
Right. But the truth is, it wasn't some carefully orchestrated thing. It was more like a chain reaction. One event setting off another, gaining momentum until, boom, the whole world was swept up in it.
Okay, I'm officially hooked. So what were some of those pivotal moments, those sparks that lit the fuse, so to speak?
Well, Braw pinpoints two events in particular that really shifted the landscape. The first, and I bet you can guess this one, was the fall of the Berlin Wall back in '89.
Okay, yeah, that's a big one, but wasn't that more of a symbolic victory, the end of the Cold War and all that?
It was definitely symbolic, but it was also a seismic shift in geopolitics. I mean, think about it. The Berlin Wall falls, and suddenly you have this whole new world order emerging. For businesses, especially in the West, it was like, boop, boom. New markets, new consumers, a whole new playing field just opened up.
I can only imagine the frenzy in those boardrooms.
Yeah.
Like striking gold.
Absolutely. And then almost simultaneously, you have China opening up its economy.
Okay, now made in China is starting to make a lot more sense.
Right. And Braw quotes this prominent banker, Michael Cole-Fontaine. He was right there in the thick of it. And he talks about this palpable excitement surrounding China's entry onto the global stage.
I bet cheap labor, tons of potential. It was like the Wild West for businesses.
Exactly. China had this massive workforce that was, well, relatively inexpensive, a hunger for growth. And they were more than willing to, embrace foreign investment. For Western companies used to, higher production costs and saturated markets back home, China was, discovering a gold mine.
It's amazing how quickly that shift happened, though. I mean, one minute we're all about made in America, and the next, it's all about finding the cheapest deal wherever that may be.
And you can't talk about globalization without talking about technology, which played a huge role in accelerating all of this. Braw uses Nokia as an example. Remember them?
Oh, yeah. I remember my first Nokia phone. It was, indestructible.
Right. And Nokia's rise is a perfect illustration of how globalization thrives on standards. Remember how we talked about everyone needing to play by the same rules?
Yeah, like a level playing field, but on a global scale.
Exactly. So Nokia, they adopted this thing called the GSM standard for mobile phones, which, get this, was actually developed in Europe. Right, so you have this European standard that ends up becoming the global norm. And suddenly, it didn't matter where you were in the world, your phone could connect to the network.
It seems so basic now, but back then, that was revolutionary.
It was huge, and it paved the way for the level of connectivity we have today.
It's wild to think how one standard for cell phones could have such a ripple effect, but that's globalization for you.
It's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another, and suddenly the whole world's connected. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it?
Right, because for all good it did, Globalization also had its share of, let's say, unintended consequences.
Exactly. And Braw doesn't shy away from that. She talks about how even amidst all the optimism of the late 20th century, there were warning signs. Like, remember the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s?
Oh, how could I forget? I think I still have some stock certificates from back then, worth about as much as a used napkin.
Right. Fortunes made and lost practically overnight. It was a stark reminder that this new interconnected market, as exhilarating as it could be, was also incredibly volatile.
And then, of course, came 9/11, which, well, that changed everything.
Absolutely. Braw spoke to John Speller, a British member of parliament, and he had already been seeing the downsides of globalization, especially in his constituency where manufacturing jobs were disappearing left and right. And he said that 9/11 just added this whole other dimension to the conversation.
I can imagine. It suddenly made the world feel a lot less interconnected and a lot more fragile.
Yeah, and it exposed this inherent vulnerability in a system that relied so heavily on global interdependence. And that fragility, well, it became impossible to ignore when the 2008 financial crisis hit.
Oh, man. 2008, that wasn't just about numbers and markets, was it? That was about people losing their homes, their livelihoods, their sense of security.
You got it. And Braw captures this raw anger that so many people felt. She talks about Michael Chertoff, the former U.S. Homeland Security Secretary, and he was furious. He couldn't believe that no one was really being held accountable for the mess.
And that anger wasn't just in the US, it was global. It felt like the whole system was rigged against everyday people.
It definitely shook people's faith in the idea that globalization was ultimately good for everyone. And it's interesting because China, while definitely affected by the crisis, kind of weathered the storm in a way that made a lot of people in the West scratch their heads.
You mean how they doubled down on their own brand of state-controlled capitalism?
Exactly. And, for some, it started to look like a pretty good alternative, maybe even more stable than the Western model. And all of this was happening just as social media was exploding onto the scene, which is fascinating because here you have this tool that's supposed to connect the world, but it also ends up fueling nationalism and giving everyone a megaphone to point out all the ways globalization was falling short.
It's like everyone got a backstage pass to see how the sausage gets made, and let's just say not everyone liked what they saw.
It's a great analogy because suddenly we were all more aware of things like sweatshop labor, environmental damage, all the not so pretty things that often go into making those cheap goods we'd gotten so used to.
It was like a wake-up call, especially for younger generations. I mean, Gen Z, they grew up in this hyper-connected world, and they're not afraid to call out injustice. They want to know where their products come from, how they're made, what the environmental impact is.
Exactly. Braw argues that this generation is more ethically conscious, more discerning, and they're holding brands accountable in a way we haven't seen before. They're voting with their wallets, and companies are starting to take notice. And, this shift in consumer consciousness happened to coincide with another big development: China's growing assertiveness, particularly under Xi Jinping.
It was like, okay, we're not just the world's factory floor anymore. We're a global power now.
Exactly. And they were ready to flex their muscles, promote their own model of governance, even challenge the Western-led order. So now you've got this, perfect storm brewing, a crisis of confidence in globalization, a new generation demanding ethical practices, and a rising China asserting its own vision for the future.
Talk about a recipe for disruption.
No kidding. And this is where things get really interesting. Braw points to some key events that really exemplify this shift. One that stands out is Australia's decision to ban Huawei from its 5G network back in 2018.
Oh yeah, that was huge.
Right. And it wasn't just about technology, it was a political statement. Australia was basically saying national security trumps economic expediency, even if it means alienating a major trading partner like China.
It was a sign of things to come, wasn't it?
It really was. And then you have Lithuania, this tiny little country that allowed Taiwan to open a representative office using the name Taiwan, which of course infuriated Beijing. It was like this David and Goliath situation, but it showed that smaller countries were willing to take a stand for their values, even if it meant risking economic fallout.
And then, of course, the big one, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Talk about a wake-up call.
That was a game changer. It shattered this illusion of a world driven solely by global trade and interconnectedness. Suddenly, geopolitics was back with a vengeance.
And for a lot of businesses that had become overly reliant on global supply chains, well, it forced a reckoning.
Right. They had to decide, do we stay in Russia and risk reputational damage, or do we pull out, absorb the financial hit, and scramble to find new suppliers?
Not an easy choice.
Nope. And that's where the idea of friendshoring comes in, which Braw argues is going to be a defining characteristic of this new era.
So instead of chasing the cheapest deal, it's about finding partners who share your values, even if it costs a bit more.
Precisely. It's about prioritizing resilience and trust over pure efficiency. And that has huge implications for businesses and consumers alike.
It's a lot to process, for sure. So where do we go from here? Is this the end of globalization as we know it? What does this new landscape mean for how we live, work, consume? So we've gone from made in insert country being everywhere you look to wondering if it's all about to change. Like, totally. It's kind of mind-blowing, honestly.
Right, yeah, it really makes you think about where we go from here, right? Like, is this really goodbye to globalization as we knew it?
Right. Is there some kind of crystal ball we're missing here?
Well, if there is, I haven't found it yet. But Braw does, she offers some really interesting ideas about how to navigate this kind of new world order that seems to be emerging.
Okay, so like a roadmap for a world that's less globally connected, what she suggests.
Well, for starters, she's not saying that we're going back to some pre-globalized utopia, because let's be real, that world, it never really existed.
It's true. For all its flaws, globalization did connect us in ways we never thought possible, right?
Exactly. But what she is saying is that this whole idea of interdependence, well, it has its limits. We're seeing a kind of recalibration happening, a shift toward, and this is a term she uses, friendshoring.
Okay, friendshoring. Break that down for me.
So instead of just going with the cheapest bidder, no matter what, it's about prioritizing relationships with countries that, share your values, even if that means maybe things are a little less efficient, maybe a little pricier.
So it's like choosing your friends wisely, but on a global scale.
Exactly. It's about trust, reliability, shared values.
And that puts a lot of power in the hands of us, as consumers, as citizens. I mean, if friendshoring really is the new normal, then every time we buy something, we're kind of making a statement, right?
You got it. It's like voting with your wallet, but with global implications. Do you go for the cheapest option, even if it means supporting a company with questionable labor practices? Or do you pay a little extra for something that was made ethically, sustainably by a company that, aligns with your values?
Those are some big questions, and I'll be honest, sometimes it feels overwhelming. Like, I'm standing in the grocery store trying to read labels, figure out which certifications actually mean something, and oh yeah, stay within my budget.
It's not easy being a conscious consumer these days, that's for sure.
It's definitely a work in progress. But hey,
Yeah.
at least we're having this conversation now, right? Like, people are starting to pay attention, demand more transparency from companies, think about the impact of their choices.
Exactly. It's a global conversation, a slow and messy one, but at least it's happening.
In Braw's book, it's like she's giving us the tools to join that conversation.
Right, totally. She doesn't have all the answers, but she gives us the information we need to start asking the right questions.
So where does that leave us? What's the takeaway?
Well, I think it's a message of cautious optimism. Yeah, the world might be becoming more fragmented, more divided in some ways, but it's also becoming more discerning. Consumers are demanding better, and companies are realizing that ethical practices aren't just good for the planet, they're good for business too.
It's like, we've hit a bump in the road, a pretty big one, honestly, but we're figuring out a new way forward.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe this new path, it won't be perfect, but it might just lead to a more just, more equitable, and definitely more sustainable future for all of us.
It's something to think about, right? As we wrap up, we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of globalization. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But the next time you're shopping, take a look at those labels. Think about the stories behind the products you buy, the choices you make, and the impact they have on the world around you. Because in this new era, every decision counts. Thanks for listening.
Globalization.